that'll give her a couple more minutes to get here. But however you want to do it, Bruce, but that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds great. We'll get it started. 12:35 Central Time, that is. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. This is going to be a great session. We've got Carrie Dhanarajan and David Dhanarajan back with us again, and also additional guests, Johnny Payne and Katrina Payne, who are part of our START team down in Chattanooga. And so, or Johnny is, and I assume by extension his wife is too, because he's on call sometimes, so I'm sure he has to leave the house while she's there at home with the kids. So she's part of our family as well. So I'm very happy to have them on here today to talk about this very important issue that we started, let's see, what was this, about a month and a half ago, that we had you guys on, and we got started with it, but we only got about halfway through. So we wanted to have you back to finish things up, because there's so much information people need about people's ability to engage in religious observances and their need to engage in spiritual activities and so forth, as it being part of their culture and part of who they are. And so I'm so happy to have you here today to talk about that again. With that, Carrie has already prepared. Did you prepare a new Smarticle today? Oh, okay. So she's got us a new Get Smarticle today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie Dhanarajan to get us started.
Okay.
Carrie?
Let me share the screen. Get our Smarticle up there. Oh, get it into presentation mode. All right. Can you guys see that okay? Oops. Oh, I paused sharing. Hold on. Resume sharing. All right. Okay. So you missed the Get Smart guy holding his phone, but so today I'm going to talk about this article that I found called Facets of Faith, Spirituality, Religiosity, and Parents of Individuals with Intellectual Disabilities. And I found this article interesting because they really explored some of the questions that we looked at last week of, are people with disabilities and their families, are they religious? Are they practicing? Are they spiritual? Do they want to be involved in that kind of practice? Which I think we already know from our last CCN that yes, they do, but it's nice to have a research article to back these thoughts up. So this article examined the spiritual and religious lives of 530 parents and caregivers of family members who have intellectual disabilities. And it discussed understanding the roles and relevance of faith in the lives of parents and caregivers of family members with intellectual disabilities, and looked at multiple dimensions such as congregational involvement, spiritual beliefs and practices, social supports, and strength of religious faith. So I think they got a pretty good broad cross-section of people involved, and the article did a good job of explaining all the demographics if you were interested in getting kind of into the details of that. But the participants were 530 parents. These were biological step and adoptive parents, or primary caregivers. So that would include a grandparent or sibling who was a primary caregiver of an individual with ID. And the family members with ID ranged in age from younger than 1 through 74 years old. So again, I did think they really caught this really broad cross-section. I think the oldest family participant was like 91. So I thought that was interesting and semi-significant. Again, there was a lot of demographics given in the article. I didn't want to share all of it, but I thought this was interesting. The perceived disability severity of the people served, again, was like a pretty good bell curve cross-section: mild, moderate, severe, and very severe. And then again, the level of seriousness of behaviors, most were in the normal, quote unquote, normal range, but then going up to some very serious type behaviors. So we are kind of talking about, as we talked about last week, or last month, that, each person is different and dealing with different issues that may or may not prevent them from being involved in a worship setting. So I thought that was interesting. The demographics in the article were quite interesting, and there were a lot of them. So but I just wanted to focus on that. So the study gave the participants 4 different survey type measures that they used to kind of determine some different things. And this one examined congregational involvement. So they asked about different questions about religious affiliation, attendance, participation, and some different information like that. And had these 39 traditions that they kind of asked how much people identified with. And I thought this was interesting just to see what the different areas, they didn't just look at like Sunday morning church, but Sunday school, prayer meeting, choir, where, you know, do they participate in the choir? Were they leading prayers publicly, reading scriptures in church, serving as an usher or greeter, participating in national or international mission trips? So like, I think they looked at a lot of different aspects, and I think sometimes we think of one thing, like participating in worship being like attending one service during the week at the church building or at the, you know, at the faith building. But really there can be quite a lot culturally and spiritually that's related to, you know, your worship. And so I think as we think about inclusion, again, it's really important that we look at a lot of different areas and be creative with that. The article also assessed the religious, spiritual beliefs, practices, and social supports using the Systems of Belief inventory, and assessed the strength of religious faith using the Santa Clara Strength of Religious Faith questionnaire. So again, it was, you know, you had people just respond to these questionnaires to get their data. Most participants did identify with a particular religion, so almost 91%, and 8.3 said they did not identify with a particular religion, and 0.9 said they did not know. And then I think this was also interesting to me. The frequency of congregational attendance varied widely across the participants. So you can see that most people were, I mean, the largest percentage, not most people in the survey, but the largest percentage was attending weekly, but that was only 28.3%. So it ranged from 11.1% said never and 9.6% said several times per week. So I think it's interesting with the high percentage identifying, saying they're religious, you know, that to kind of look at, well, how often are you able to practice that religion in congregational attendance? And then are they practicing some other, you know, different practices, like the other survey kind of indicated there could be different practices that they are engaged in that don't fall under congregational attendance. So I thought that was an interesting data point. And then, so this I thought was also interesting from the survey. Participants reported somewhat lower levels of agreement with items related to social support. So 72.9 said they agreed they enjoyed attending religious functions, but only 35.5 somewhat or strongly agreed they'd seek out people at their religious or spiritual community when they need help. So again, like that leads me to think of like further research questions, like, you know, I think a weakness of this study, I'll just really a control group. So we don't have a comparison number. It would have been nice to also have, you know, 500 people who didn't have a family member with an intellectual disability to compare. But I wonder if this 35.5% number is significantly lower than the typical population, or if maybe that is in line with the typical population. I don't know. So, okay, so there was overall agreement with items related to spiritual and religious beliefs and practices, and overall agreement with the strength of faith. So I think just again, these numbers are sort of saying these were people of faith at a high percentage, and that they did sort of identify with that. So I think that's, you know, important to know. And so just to kind of wrap up our SMARTicle, I just wanted to touch on the 5 takeaways, and this came straight from the article. Most of these were quotes from the article, so this was drawn pretty straight from the article, not Carrie's brilliant assessment or distillation of it. But the 5 takeaways were that religion and spirituality, I've gotten off my takeaways, are important to the people surveyed, and that the people surveyed showed religious diversity, spiritual and religious participation may contribute to the well-being of the families surveyed, and they seem to report that they obtain hope and comfort from these experiences. And the relevance of people's faith could have implications for professionals that work with them. Understanding this faith is key to providing culturally competent and family-centered support. So if we ignore this really important aspect, I think it's our detriment if we're trying to work with people, other health or stability in their community. I think this is an important aspect. And then greater engagement of faith communities may be needed to support the spiritual and religious lives of the families with people with disabilities. And I think that really tied nicely into where we're going with our talk on inclusion, and that, this is not just a side issue as far as people in the form of worship that they want to engage in or in the community, pretty central to a lot of people in their support. I think it's really important that we are able to assist them. Article for today.
You did this, but you did a perfect segue into our next week's CCN, because Eric Carter, who's one of the authors of this article, is going to be our presenter next week. Not on this topic, on a different topic about families' need for different services and supports. But it's very interesting. You used his article.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
And
well, it's actually going to be next month. I typed it. It's going to be April 5th.
April 5th. Okay, I'm sorry. Babs, thank you for correcting me there. But yes, but for today, very glad to have you guys back. And I'm going to give you just a minute to introduce yourselves. And you can recycle your interesting fact if you have to, but if you have a new interesting fact, you can share that as well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'll go ahead and start and then pass it to my husband, and then we'll pass it over there to you, Johnny and Katrina. But my name is Carrie Dhanarajan. I'm the coordinator of behavior services at DIDD and the assistant clinical director with Penn Start program, and also a pastor's wife, and have been in the ministry for many years as well. And I'm really excited to share these thoughts about inclusion and just to brainstorm, and that I think this topic goes beyond just one piece to like thinking of inclusion in such a broad sense with like all aspects of our community lives, which I think is really important. And my interesting fact for today, I'm obsessed with the movie Encanto, and I love to just talk about it and the family relationships and the dynamics and the hidden scenes. I watch the YouTube videos. I love it. So if you ever want to just have a meeting about that, call me. I'll be on it. Go ahead.
Yes, I love that movie. That is a great movie, Encanto. Yeah, I watched it with my grandchildren, so.
Good movie. Well, thanks, Carrie. As Carrie said, I'm David, and Carrie's husband, and we've been married for 20 years now.
David, husband.
Interesting fact. I don't know. There are a couple that came up, but an interesting fact about me is that my favorite movie, which happens to be the greatest movie ever created, is Karate Kid 1. And watched that movie many times, and I was inspired that I cut all my white shirts diagonally to be like a karate outfit. But that's not the interesting fact. The interesting fact is, as a pastor in a Protestant church, I may or may not have preached an entire series based on Mr. Miyagi's teachings of Daniel LaRusso.
Okay.
Very close. Jesus and Miyagi are close. So I love that movie. As she loves Encanto.
All right. So I have to ask, are you a fan of the subsequent series, Cobra Kai?
We've watched pretty much all of that. I do like the throwback memories. It is quite ridiculous, but I guess
yes, there are ridiculous aspects to it, but it's so enticing. You can't really avoid watching it. You can't turn away. But
That's right.
I love the Miyagi stories, though. Those are very good. They actually bring a lot out that I think has application within our field, especially when you talk about balance. It's such a key aspect of everything that we do. I think that's so important. So, well, thank you for that. And also, guest today is the Payne family, Johnny Payne and Katrina Payne. So I'm glad to have you guys here. Why don't you introduce yourselves real quick?
All right, we agreed I would go first to give her more room to gather interesting facts about herself in one place. Okay, interesting fact about me. To borrow a phrase from David, I may or may not love meatloaf. But additionally, I once lived in a school bus in Alaska.
Introduce who you are.
Oh, yeah. Hey, I'm Johnny Payne. I am a START coordinator or a facilitator with the assessment stabilization teams with the ED in the Chattanooga region. And I think about this topic, I think I should say briefly that I've done a lot of thinking and research, not primary research so much as peer review around this topic. I'm pretty passionate about this area and of what faith communities, worship communities can mean for people with disabilities and mental health challenges. Yeah.
I'm Katrina Payne. I currently serve as the pastor of Mercy Ministries here at the Mission Chattanooga, but I've worked for the mission since 2013 and worn many, many hats in that time. And yeah, he told me as y'all were talking, you have to have an interesting fact. And so I scrambled. I do occasionally preach here at the mission, though I'm not the primary preacher. And when I write sermons, I like to listen to EDM because it just gets me going.
Yep.
And that's my
Listen to what?
for sermons and dubstep and
So you preach sometimes, and that doesn't count the times you have to get on to Johnny about keeping his space clean and those types of things.
His socks, this is an interesting fact about Johnny. His socks like to find the corners of the house.
I like to help them.
And I assume, Johnny, when you mentioned Meatloaf, you're talking about the musical artist.
Meatloaf.
Or you're talking about dish Meatloaf.
I'm talking about the food meatloaf.
Oh, okay. Well, I needed to clarify. Okay, thank you for that. I'll remember that when you guys come over for dinner sometime. All right. Well, with that, Carrie, should I turn it over to you? Who's taking over here?
Yep, I'm taking over. I'm going to get my share going here. Oh, get that off. Sorry, I got to get between the PowerPoints. All right, let's get that PowerPoint going. All right. Yes, we are ready to go. All right, so this is part 2 of creating an environment of inclusion in places of worship, and we are excited to have a couple extra presenters today because today we really want to share some stories of inclusion and just some practical tips that we just didn't quite get to last time. And so to start, I just want to kind of mention that when we're talking about inclusion and intellectual disabilities, we use a lot because, of course, we're with the Department of Intellectual Disabilities, but really all areas of neurodiversity could kind of fall into what we're talking about today. I mean, we could see a lot of different issues and concerns that might be a barrier to someone being in worship, or that we hope will no longer be barriers, but maybe something that needs addressed. But a lot of these are quote unquote invisible. I mean, that being said, someone might walk into your church and you don't see it to start, but that doesn't mean that they don't need support and assistance in that. So it's really important to remember that. And I think the theme today and the theme in what we talk about is sort of being open, listening, and hearing what's said to you to make a way for people to feel included, because it's not so much about the facts as the feelings in a way, and that we want to be open to making our spaces welcoming and ready for people with differences. So we're going to talk about some do's and don'ts as we go through this. And I'm initially going to hand this over to Johnny, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about some ideas about preparing the environment to start when you're wanting your church to be, or your religious place of worship to be welcoming.
Cool. Thanks, Gary. So I want to start talking about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, was a really landmark legislation that was passed in 1990 and deliberated heavily in 1988, 1989. And it has assured a lot of rights and opportunities for folks with disabilities, similar to a lot of our other protected groups, like racial groups or gender or things like this. So, but the ADA does not apply to worship groups or any types of places of worship. This is actually something I've looked a lot into, and I would invite you to dig a little bit deeper into that if you'd like. I am putting a link in the chat about that. And so let me make sure that's the right one. Yeah. All right, cool. So more on that article. But though worship groups, places of worship, are not legally bound to upholding the ADA, a lot of places of worship have really taken on sort of a moral imperative to uphold those aspects of the ADA. And really even making changes and accommodations to their environments, programming, services, to ensure that people with different disabilities can access and hopefully feel like a sense of belonging within those communities. And so what I'll review here are some of the ways that a lot of these places of worship have done that across the country. And so I actually want to take a step back real quick and look at a big picture idea that is used in a lot of these ideas, and that's the idea of universal design. And so this was a big piece of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the universal design. And so a lot of churches have carried that directly into creating changes for their own places of worship. And so universal design is the idea that leaders and designers of programs or spaces take different abilities, diverse abilities into consideration whenever they're designing these things, like programs and activities, material spaces. Like, just imagine like a worship space, a worship community, be it a mosque or a synagogue or a church, like all of the different ways that a person interacts with that faith, tradition, and community, from printed materials to access to the building to the ways that services are conducted and rhythms. All of that can be considered in light of people's different abilities and accommodated for before they ever get to the church. And interestingly enough, a lot of faith leaders I have heard say, well, why would we make any of these accommodations? People with disabilities never come to our places of worship, but it's kind of the chicken and the egg, right? A lot of folks say that they don't want to come, or they don't come because they don't feel welcome there, and there's not a space for them, right? So let's get back onto like universal design. How are a lot of places of worship doing this? So for one, there is the 20% rule. So updates to spaces, especially as the ADA passed and places of worship were considering making very expensive changes to accommodate people with disabilities, the cost of doing so was a big consideration and deterrent from participating in the ADA. But the 20% rule is based off this idea that about 20% of the U.S. population has some kind of a disability. And that's very, very broadly speaking. But if that's the case, then in designing programs or even new structures related to a place of worship, 20% of the overall cost of that project can be attributed to considering people with different abilities. So, for example, a church remodeling for $100,000 could earmark $20,000 for accessibility features, or like take $10,000 for a new sound system, and $2,000 can go towards an ear loop for people with hearing impairments, right? And so, I mean, that can be carried all over the different aspects of worship.
So, let me clarify what you're saying there, Johnny. Are you saying that this is a way of planning is for this 80-20 split, or is this what the ADA requires?
No,
or
sir. This is really just a recommendation based off of a breakdown of the American population, basically. Yeah.
If you take the number 20% of people have a disability, then you devote 20% of your budget to accommodating that group.
Yes, absolutely. And this is not mentioned in the ADA, but this is just an idea as a good rule of thumb for considering. And again, when you think about accessibility versus accommodation, and building a space that people can come to instead of questioning why aren't people coming to my space. Then looking at disability policy for places of worship. There are kind of like a local ADA, a local piece of legislation that a church can agree to. And Carrie, we might actually just go to the next slide on this one. There are church leaders can adopt and implement a disability policy for their place of worship. And they can include how our service is going to accommodate people with various disabilities, or how are we going to adjust our environment for considerations of sensory aspects, right? Or how are we going to speak about people with disabilities or mental health challenges from a place of messaging? And so I'm going to drop another resource into the chat, and this is a template, a draft of a disability policy that could be used in a place of worship, whatever that is. And so that's a great resource that might be helpful to get things started there. And then finally, I want to talk about how individual members of a worship community could kind of anticipate opportunities to create welcome and affect how the worship community is interacting with people who are coming in. Because I think that we've kind of looked at like the big picture of like how leaders can influence, but then now how individuals might. So, you know, many of these don't cost anything, which that's the other side of this is a lot of places of worship haven't wanted to participate because it can be expensive. But a lot of these don't cost much of anything, like some of these ideas that are listed here on the slide specifically. These changes also kind of represent a shift of perspective and beginning to consider how services and programs and physical space may create stumbling blocks, which I'll borrow stumbling block phrase from Christian culture there. But there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit, easy ways to anticipate a person's need and be able to create that place of welcome before that person maybe is even there. I want to say just a little bit about a perspective change here, because these perspective changes that could help a person, a church leader, a worship community leader, be ready to consider these changes, or how someone might come and attend programming in a church community or be a part of church community that looks different than they do, interact different, experience the world differently than they do. I think it takes a big perspective shift. And these ideas don't come along naturally. So I just want to be careful to say that it takes advocates like us to patiently and kindly help busy faith leaders and community members in places of worship to be educated, and then to support those persons in implementing ideas to make these worship places more of places of belonging. It doesn't come naturally, especially within faith traditions. We tend to be around people and ideas that are like the ideas that we're very much used to. And so it takes advocates like us to do that very patiently. And so one final tool that I'll share to that point, and I'll drop this into the chat. This is a disability accessibility self-audit tool and checklist that a place of worship could use to look at their programs and spaces to determine how is a person affected by the various different facets of our community and what changes might be considered. So I'll stop right there and hand this whole thing right on back to Carrie.
All right,
That's
awesome.
excellent. So just going to mention, your advocacy point, I think, is one well taken, because nothing ever happens unless there's advocacy behind it. And, I don't think it's a blaming culture, but one of, let's see what we can accomplish here. What can we bring forth to make all this work? And the other aspect of it is, I think there's so much misunderstanding about disability, going back to Carrie's initial point about the neurodiversity of the group that we're talking about, because there's a great tendency, I think, on the part of people who aren't part of the work that we do to paint everybody with intellectual disability or everybody with disability with a broad brush, and not realize that there are lots of differences between people, even within the disabled population. So
Yeah,
these are just important points. Go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's interesting, in the churches we served in most recently, the youngest sort of Gen Z that are starting college and down, they almost have a better ability to advocate for themselves, because they've really embraced the idea of neurodiversity, and many of them have recognized in themselves, their place on a spectrum. And so sometimes they're the ones who are really open to talking about this, where some of, us older people or the people above us, change is hard. Change is hard for all of us, but as we advocate, it really can be good for the people that we serve, and good for all of us. It's good for all of us. That's the thing. Okay, so I'm going to jump in. I'm going to move through some of these do's and don'ts quickly, because I want to get to the most important part of what we're sharing today, the stories of inclusion. But I think the first step, as we get people, Johnny talked about some environmental modifications, and then we get people kind of coming in the door or asking questions or being curious about what we're doing at our place of worship. We want to be welcoming. We want to ask questions, especially as we think about, we did a lot of this thinking about like kids with differences or disabilities. So we want to ask names and ages, describe the programming we have, provide some general information, questionnaires to all parents. So we're not singling anyone out, because like I said, we don't always know who has a atypical issue. And then end your conversations with parents, new parents, in a general question, like, is there anything important we need to know about your child? Giving every parent the space to talk about that. And, as leaders, faith leaders, even with other adults, it's a nice way to kind of open up the conversation, like, hey, tell me about yourself. We'll kind of open the space for people to tell you about what they are going through or how they identify or that sort of thing. But don't ask people, like, what is wrong with your child? That's kind of obvious. The child has a diagnosis. Don't ask if they have a diagnosis or disability, and don't ask personal or medical questions. Obviously, as you get to know parents, if there's an important medical thing you need to know, they'll let you know if they're giving their child into your care. So again, with those open-ended questions, and kind of using an information packet as a starting place. That's particularly, we were talking about kids here, because when you have kids come into your kids program, their parent generally is leaving. So we want to know what we need to know about that situation. We want to use people first language and avoid labeling kids, and be, examples of that kind of openness. And I just wanted to, for a moment, kind of touch on what I think we talked a little bit about earlier, is people are coming into worship with a history of experiences, and some of those are traumatic. and some of them are hurtful, and there might be anger because as a person with that was neuroatypical or a disability or a difference, they may not have been welcome in previous situations. They may have faced, felt like they were an inconvenience, or that they weren't welcome, or that they were too disruptive, or that their child was. And so when you have someone who comes in, remember, they may have had negative interactions in the past. And so be ready to be understanding and listen. Again, coming back to that theme, like listen and adjust, and, let them take time to share their experience with you. And so now I'm going to hand it over to my husband, David, and let him tell a story of inclusion related to camp.
Well, thank you, Carrie. And I've been in ministry in the church, Protestant church, for over 20 years now as well, and working with children from infant, just being born, all the way up to, as a lead pastor, up to the oldest in our congregation. So I've kind of seen a broad spectrum of people within my congregation and been overseeing the ministry there. One of the stories that Carrie asked that I'd share is, along with being a pastor and having my congregation, I was also the director of children's ministries for our denomination on the Florida district. And so we held a camp every summer for kids, and around 400 kids plus adults and help would be there. And it was quite an undertaking. And as you can imagine, in June in Florida, it gets really hot, and it can get pretty tense there among workers and campers. But it's a fun experience, and we would encourage everyone to go, and we would make it as accessible as possible to come. But what we didn't realize is that we were not including those with intellectual disabilities, or in a broader scope, those with disabilities at all. And so we weren't clear for our desire for them to participate, but also we weren't clear in our communication that we were ready for them and that we were having an environment that was welcoming for them. So one year, it was very early on, this would have been around 2014, and we had a camp. It was our very first night. Kids had checked in, they got their cabins and beds and groups, and they were coming in. And this one group of boys came in, and they sat down, and the music was playing loud. And it's the first night of kids camp. So we wanted it to be loud and fun and exciting. And one of the boys in this cabin group started to have some behaviors and acted really kind of like they didn't want to be there. And without knowing or notifying anyone, the counselor thought, well, this child who was autistic can't handle loud noises, and so took the child out of the worship space. And the child began to act out even more. And the adult went on Facebook and started posting about this situation without coming to the leaders of the camp. I just happened to be on it and see it. And so I immediately get Carrie involved in the conversation and explain the situation. And Carrie brought some very good things to the table. What we immediately did was we called the guardian and found out it wasn't loud noises that the child was reacting to. It was the fact that we had the seats so close together and they felt closed in. So all we had to do was spread out the chairs, and that child just had one of the best times. He loved to dance, and he was so engaged. And so it taught us really quickly, one, that we just can't assume anything as leaders in a spiritual setting and place, and that can go for anything. But what we also realized too, is what Carrie said, is that we didn't know there was an issue because no one ever communicated with us. And there was a lot of hesitation, and we mentioned last time too on our training that there's a lot of shame that can go into it. And parents they want their kids to be accepted, and if they feel like if they highlight an issue, well, then somehow their child won't be welcomed into that space or turned away, or we would overcompensate and make the child feel uneasy about what's happening. So we kind of had to go back to the drawing board and said, okay, what are the things that we're going to do? So one of the things we did was we spent a lot of time in our material and communication to parents and to churches about that week and what every day of that week is going to be like and what the situation is going to be. So we spent a lot of time on communicating and orienting parents, leaders, campers on what the week is going to look like and what each day is going to look like and what they can expect. And we found that that helps a lot too. And we also had counselors. Anytime there was a change in activity, or we would talk, they would talk to the cabin. Now we're going to leave here and we're going to be going to this next place. We're going to be involved in that. We also train, and the counselors have specific information too about children in their group that they should know, and that could help them better lead the children there. So we spent a lot of time with communicating and orientation with that. We also made it available. We went ahead and changed our entire venue for camp, and we moved to a bigger campground. We spent a lot more money, but we made it possible that any parent that wants their child to participate, but there's an issue there that keeps them from participating. We've had children come that the parents were scared because they were an older child and they still wet the bed, and they didn't want their child to be embarrassed with other kids. So we had almost a family-style camp with personal cabins for families, so they participated throughout the day, and at night they were able to go and be with their family. And that had really helped too. We saw a lot more parents and families being more comfortable about having their kids participate. We did change some of the things. We went away from, we don't always have to scream when we're excited. We can do a silent scream. We can snap our fingers if we want, or we can raise our hand. We can do other things to show that we are excited to be there. So we try to be diverse also in the way we engage, because our goal was, we just didn't want children attending. We wanted them to be a part of what was happening. And I think that's an important thing for all religious spaces, is that attendance is good. We want them there, but we want them to be a part of that. We want their participation to be a natural outflow of what we do when we gather together. So the transition from that, when the last years we were there, we had a camp. I was approached by someone and they said, hey, we go to a Nazarene church, and I knew the individual, and they said, I'm the caretaker of my younger cousin, and she has significant disabilities, physically, intellectual, and they were pretty severe, unlike we had ever seen before. And I was almost ready to say that that's beyond what we can handle. But I decided, let's talk about it. Let's see what needs to be in place for this child to succeed throughout the week. And we came up with a great plan, and we had other trained people there as well to be there. And we, long story short, she had one of the best weeks. She was all smiles the entire time. She was almost nonverbal. She could barely say anything, but she just was, you could tell in her presence, she was just so grateful to be there. And it meant so much to her parents. And I'm thankful that we had made the steps and we created a space. Although we may not be perfect, we're willing to try and to be open to communication for that. So I'm really excited about that. The last thing is with that, we realize that kids are, especially in that setting, they're a lot more accepting and natural with those with disabilities and some differences. I think maybe as adults we have we are a little bit overly concerned on how our children will interact. But as I saw throughout the week and time in that space, that kids are very open. And if we're not making it a big deal, it's natural for them to have their children around. Also, I'd like to say, whenever you're working, especially with families, I try to, every communication I had with them, I would write down partnering with parents. It didn't matter who it was. That was my thing, partnering parents, Pastor David. And I wanted to create a culture where I am partnering with you. I want your child to succeed just as much as you do, and whatever we can do, I want to create that. So I'm not just taking the show, I'm partnering with you as well. And I wrote down something else really good. Oh, one of the things we did, it was really good, my handwriting's terrible. I feel lucky that I have Carrie right here with me, but we made space in our budget to make sure not only do we have nurses and medical professionals at our camps, but we also made in our budget space to bring on those who are specialized, as Carrie in this field, to be that go-to person when children in our camp would have behaviors. They could contact Carrie immediately, and she was on the premise, able to go and kind of intervene in situations before they escalated to something broader. So that is a worthwhile thing to tap the professionals that you are connected to, and don't be afraid to ask and use them.
She's really great at de-escalation. That I know. So, yeah. But that is such a great story, two great stories to tell there about different folks that you've worked with. And one of the things I especially liked about what you said was you're listing out all of the activities that people are going to be engaged in. Because it's one thing to say, oh, well, tell us what your kid's issues are or what your concerns are, but just a diagnosis or something that somebody's going to tell you. That doesn't really give you the information you need. You need to know how they're going to react when you have them sitting close together, with a lot of other people. Those are the types of information you need. And when you get those, it makes the job a lot easier and more effective. That you're able to help the person engage in their spiritual activity. So that's fantastic. Carrie?
I just want to touch real quick. I'm not going to go too much into the slide, but to mention a book, The Disability in the Way of Jesus by Bethany McKinney Fox. I think Johnny's going to flash the cover maybe. Being real careful when we are talking to people about, spiritually speaking, healing. I think we saw this slide last time because I think Adam noted that in the Jewish tradition, healing is not as much of a part of the tradition as in maybe the Protestant churches, but being really careful how we talk about healing with people with disabilities, but Disability in the Way of Jesus, if you're interested in a book about that. And just real quickly on this slide, I want to get to Johnny and Katrina. Building a network, as David said, not just relying on, one pastor cannot answer all of the questions about disabilities. And I noted here, sometimes people in your church will actually get the diagnosis while you're working with, while you know them, and they'll come to you and say, my son just got diagnosed autism. What does this mean? Build a network, get some resources, get contacts in your community before the question so that you're really ready to share. And don't think that you're going to be able to solve everything for someone who comes to you, but have those contacts and resources ready to share. But now I'm going to pass it over to Johnny and Katrina because I want to hear their stories of inclusion.
Thanks, Carrie. I'll share real quick, and then our boys are next door here, about to be done with preschool, so I'm going to go hop over and get them. So the Mission Chattanooga is, we are 12 years old, and we have one friend in particular who has been with us pretty consistently from the beginning. We've not seen him as much in the last couple of years because of COVID, and we've moved buildings, but we still have people within our church who are in contact with him. We'll call him Ricky. Ricky has some sort of chronic psychosis, some severe mental health challenges. He seems like he has some hallucinations. He responds to internal stimuli. For as long as we've known him and longer, he has been he's experienced homelessness. And so, all of those things are things that definitely can make people feel very uncomfortable. And at times it has made people within the mission feel uncomfortable. Our church space includes it's a third space, we call it. We're open throughout the entire week. We have a coffee shop and all those sorts of things. And Ricky would often show up throughout the week. And I think this really worked to our advantage, but of course not all places of worship have that ability. But to interact with him throughout the week, we often would offer him a cup of coffee. Ricky is not a big talker, but, always say hi to him, always, call him by name when we would see him. So this is I'm going a little bit out of order in terms of our story with Ricky throughout our relationship with him. But early on, we would pass, the offering baskets around during a church service. And we had multiple services on a Sunday, and he would show up for every single service. He wouldn't just come for one, like the 9:30 a.m. service. He'd come for all of them. And a lot of the time, he would just sit. He wouldn't necessarily come forward for communion or participate in certain ways, but he would be there. And every once in a while, as the baskets were passed, he would slip a piece of paper into the offering basket. And at the beginning, as you know, people were counting the offering and things like that, it was always a little like strange. It was just a random list of numbers.
Like the offering envelope that like a check or whatever would go in was just covered in numbers. A series of numbers, right?
No one could make heads or tails of it, you know, like, oh, okay, whatever, and let's throw it out. But over time, we came to understand through piecing together small things he would tell us, because again, he wouldn't talk a whole lot. He had the understanding, he had the belief that he was directly related to, I think it was like Thomas Jefferson or something. And as such, he had access to a bank account with a ton of money. And what he was giving us was the routing number and his social security number, with the belief that, you know, we could access this bank account. And what happened out of that, instead of it being just really like, oh yeah, whatever, Ricky is doing this thing, it was a really beautiful way to connect with him. You know, like it didn't actually do anything for us. We couldn't actually go and get this money out of a bank account, but it was his way of contributing. And to recognize that, not just to recognize it when we read it, but to recognize it with him and to say, hey, Ricky, thank you so much for your gift today.
But like, but we were able to take the time to know that about him over time, and instead of seeing it as like just an empty, quirky action, it was him participating in worship.
Right.
And we got to like enable and empower that thing in him, instead of just giving it like seeing it as some quirky anecdote or something.
Right. I think that's a danger that's easy to fall into of, oh, so and so, you know, part of their psychosis or part of their disability or part, you know, whatever, is like, oh, they do this thing and isn't it funny, or like, you know, whatever. But that's sometimes, not all the time, sometimes there's a real meaning to that, and to be able to enter into a relationship with that. So we've also, you know, visited his camp where he lives, all these different things. But I want to, for the sake of time, briefly share about something that we're creating that actually was inspired by our relationship with Ricky. We've recently moved to a new location, a new building. We're right around the corner from the Chattanooga Community Kitchen, which serves our area's homeless population. And there are tents everywhere right around here. And so as we got ready to move over here, we created something called a mental health first responders team. And their role is to be available. So not always, but a lot of times, along with homelessness comes some mental illness and mental health challenges. And so as we're so close, we tend to get people who trickle in throughout the week, but also during our services. And these mental health first responders can model interactions and normalize positive reactions and interactions with people who might be experiencing psychosis. And so they're trained people who either we're helping to train, or most of them have experience in their work life or past or something with mental health challenges and things like that. And so the idea is that if someone comes in, that this team of people, it's not just that, oh, they're the only ones who interact with them, but they're the ones that are equipped well enough to welcome them specifically, to model welcoming to them. And what happens as that happens, what we've seen with Ricky, is that as people come around him who are used to him, who know how to interact with him, the greater community feels more at ease and is more ready to interact with him as well, and to welcome him, and to really find ways and recognize the ways that he in particular enriches our community, and not as just someone who comes and sits with us.
Yeah, and I'll just say also, like, we come from a very liturgical tradition, like with a lot of rhythms and traditions in the Anglican Church. and there's a lot of sort of unspoken ways of interacting that's not written on a sign somewhere, and this is very common in faith traditions. But having someone as sort of a gatekeeper that comes alongside of someone who interacts differently and normalizes positive interaction with that person, it allows everyone else's sort of attention and perception of that thing, of that interaction, to feel normal and even safe. I'll add one more resource.
I need to go grab the boys. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Christina.
Casey. I'm just going to add one more resource into the chat here, and this is actually about Dr. Carter, who's going to be speaking here soon about belonging. And so I just want to say that, you know, we can get a person into a building, and we can make programming and services accessible for a person. But just because they get into the building and they can hold the paper and read the sign doesn't mean that they belong. And so we want to actually help a person move past accessing to truly belonging. And so Dr. Carter did a lot of work around identifying what does belonging look like and how do we create that for people with disabilities in faith communities specifically. So that's also in the chat.
Thanks, Johnny.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just gonna, let's see, check the time. It's 2:31. Basically, the end slides talk about just having a plan. And I think we've talked about lots of different ideas. So I think we've gotten plenty to inspire you to go from here and think through having a plan, talk to people, be open to them. It's not always going to go right. It's not always going to go 100% perfect. I'm sure not every conversation with Ricky and not every camp experience was perfect, but it was those imperfections that led to the change and the idea of like, how can we be better? And so just remembering, you know, to take into consideration where people are at. So, I mean, there's still ideas for planning. You got to have volunteers. You could do a buddy system. You could do, you know, special areas, quiet areas, classes that are mixed, classes that are have some ability to separate if a child gets overwhelmed. There's so much you can do. But I think the idea, the point of this is like, it's not just the little ideas. You can Google ideas. That's easy. But it's having that passion in your worship space, that idea of inclusion, belonging, that we're open to this and we're all learning and growing at the same time to get better at that space. So our contact information is here, all the emails. You can email Dr. Davis to get any of this information or myself, and I'll share if you want to reach out. But that's pretty much it for us. I think we've had 2 really great weeks of talking about inclusion.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. This was excellent presentation. You know, Johnny, you brought up some good points. I think this is, religion and, you know, spiritual activities, worship, are all just another example of activities that people with disabilities have to be weaved into in the community. It's not unique in that way, but you used a very important word, which was participation. We don't just want people to be present. We want them to also be able to participate in a meaningful way. And it seems like you found that with Ricky. That was really a very, very important part of what you did there. I'm so thankful you guys coming on and talking about this very important subject, because I think it often gets ignored for people with that are in our service systems. And so it's something that really needs to be addressed in each and every case. Carrie, you had mentioned the concerns with praying for healing for someone with disabilities. I think that's a very important subject. You know, we often think about acceptance versus change in circumstances like this, and that acceptance is often more comforting for people than trying to continually change something that might not change that much. I'm always, you know, I have a belief in God's ability to heal, but it doesn't happen in every case. And I was just going to mention that there's a great resource for it, that a book that I recently worked with in our Sunday school class at church by Philip Yancey, named "Where is God When It Hurts?" And so I'm going to just put that in the chat that if people want to consult that reference, there's a great treatment of that subject that you were talking about in that book. And I appreciate everybody being here on the Clinical Consultation Network. Of course, we do this once a week and at 12:30 Tuesdays. Please tell your friends to join us, and we will see you again next week for another exciting episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.